Hello there, and what we have here is a project that I've been looking at starting for quite some time. I've actually had both of these units now since, one since 2017 and the other from about February of this year. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually unboxing the second of units, and the unit in question is a Grundig 2X4 V2000 video cassette recorder. Now, if you know your video formats, you got Betamax, VHS, and Video 2000. And Video 2000 was limited, I believe, to the European markets, whereas Betamax and VHS were available across the world stage. Betamax sort of had quite a bit of success on the JDM, so the Japanese domestic market, whereas VHS had sort of worldwide success and became the de facto standard. However, amongst those two contenders, you had Video 2000, which was pioneered by Philips. And a number of manufacturers got on board the Video 2000 bandwagon, mainly manufacturers that had long-running associations with Philips. So you had Bang & Olufsen, Pi, Grundig, and obviously Philips, all producing their own versions of Video 2000 decks. Now, Grundig seem to actually produce their own decks, whereas Pi, Bang & Olufsen and Philips all used obviously Philips based technology within their decks. It seems that Grundig did sort of, to a certain extent, go their own way with the standard. So I've actually got two decks. Both of them are mostly identical, apart from the first Video 2000 deck that I got, which has actually got the optional extra remote control sender unit or receiver unit. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the remote control module itself, and that is something that I need to get hold of. Now, the original unit I got actually had stuck inside it a Video 2000 cassette, and what actually happened was when I turned the machine on, it powered up absolutely fine, but when I tried to eject the cassette, it blew one of the capacitors on the power supply board. So what I did was I decided to buy another machine which was said to work, although it had some problems with deck function, so I could basically raid the power supply board from that machine and put it into my original machine. Now, it actually turns out that the power supply board on the original machine is just a blown reefer capacitor, so basically a main suppressor. There's two of them on the board itself, and I believe that there are modern substitutes for these. So what I will be doing at some point is resurrecting the spares machine I've got. So hopefully I'll end up with two Video 2000 decks, which will be quite a nice addition to my fleet of various video recorders. Quite an unusual deck, this one. It's got quite a nice gold coloured fascia, which I think really does look quite smart. And it's also front loading, which for a deck of this era is quite unusual. And I'm just going to consult literally reaching up onto the shelf here, just going to go and consult the Complete Video Guide, a book from 1981, I think, by a guy called Tim Smith. Yeah, published in 1981. Let's have a look and see if we can find anything about this deck, if it's there. So I'm not sure if this is actually a later model. So we got the Philips VR 2020 and the Pi VR 2020, which are identical decks. Yeah, here we are. It's the Grundig 2X4 Super, which is what this one is. The price, or the average price, was £629. That was in 1981. I'll just read a little bit about what Tim Smith has to say about it. The latest addition to the Grundig range, the most unusual thing about the 2x4 or 2X4 Super is that it can record a program up to an amazing 99 days in advance. Quite why someone would wish to record a programme 99 days in advance, or for that matter how anyone could find out what is on television 99 days in advance, is questionable. Nevertheless, it's the most advanced of the range and only slightly more expensive than the 2x4 Plus. The 2x4 Plus was £600, and it's built up an highly impressive reputation for reliability. And even at this early stage, if you do decide to buy European and risk the Video 2000 format, this machine is your best bet. He even said at this sort of early stage of the format that it was a risk to actually go for it. I mean, it is quite interesting because Philips were the dominating home video recorder format in the 1970s with their VCR format. Anyway, onto the task in hand. So, with the spares machine unplugged, what I'm doing is I'm taking out the power supply board, and to do that you need to disconnect the various wires or cables that are going into it. You need to remove the base, and you also need to remove the plug itself. Obviously the plug is not going to go through the machine. There is, at the back of the machine, as you can see here, a little plastic locating tab that holds the flex in place. And once you actually sort of get the machine spun over, or sort of turned upright, you can actually unravel that plug and pull the flex through. One thing that you do notice, and this is quite novel, and I've only ever seen one other video recorder do this, is you've got what looks like a main board, almost like a motherboard, and then you have slotted into that motherboard all of the various control boards for the video recorder itself. A lot of video recorders of this era had two large boards on the underside of the machine, with a number of boards linked to those boards via ribbon cables, whereas this one, actually those boards plug directly into that motherboard. It makes the machine very modular and means that replacement was surprisingly simple. What I'm doing here is I'm just comparing the two part numbers on the boards. They do look like they're from a different batch, but they are actually the same board. So coming up and bringing my original machine back onto the table, what I can do now is I can use the power supply board that I got out of the spares / hopefully will be rejuvenated as well machine, and thread it all through and plug the board in. It literally just is a case of making sure that you've got the board lined up with the plastic locator and metal locators, and then making sure that the connectors on the bottom of the board line up with the pins on the motherboard itself. The only other machine I've seen use a system similar to this is the JVC 7... I want to say 7650. No, it's not the 7650. It's the 73. Oh, I can't think. The equivalent Ferguson version is the Ferguson 3V23. And just looking behind me, the equivalent Nordmend version is the... what's that one? It's a Spectravision V500. The 3V23 and equivalent JVC versions have got this rather nice setup, a bit like this Grundig, where you've got all of the main boards plugged into almost like a motherboard setup, and it's sort of quite a nice setup and does seem to maximise on the sort of potential real estate inside the machine. It also makes for, by the standards of the day, a machine that was, or did appear to be, certainly slightly slimmer than some of the competition. The interesting thing about the Video 2000 format is the fact that you could turn the tapes over. So you had one side of the recording was 4 hours, and then the other side of the recording was another 4 hours, so you could actually get 8 hours recording time on one tape. You obviously had to flip it over manually yourself, but I think when the format died there were actually developments in place to try and make an auto-reverse mechanism. I'm not quite sure how that would have worked, but it certainly would have been interesting to see it in action. There were also innovations of the standard which certainly when Sony and Philips were developing, I believe it was the Video 8 format, Sony actually got to take advantage of some of the innovations from the Video 2000 setup. Or was it Video 8 being developed? I can't remember. There was a particular event where Sony and Philips worked together, and Sony got to take a large amount of technology from the Video 2000 format. I'm not sure if it was the dynamic track following or something along those lines. Another interesting feature was the video heads would actually keep sync with a tape track up to 10 times normal speed. So it meant that Video 2000 machines had unbelievably good for the time trick functions such as fast forward, search, fast rewind search, pause and slow motion, and they were quite enviable in that sort of arena. Unfortunately, the format didn't really sort of take a hold over here, and I think it was by about 1984 or 85 the format was pretty much dead in the water. There were actually some releases, actually some sort of actual software releases, in other words film releases for the particular Video 2000 format. So there was actually a point where you could get the films that were coming out on 3 different available formats. So the first thing I did once I got the machine plugged back in was to eject the tape that had been in there for so long. I'm not sure how many years that tape had been in there, but it was certainly probably nearly 20 or possibly even 30 years that tape has been stuck in that machine. So it's quite an interesting, nice little mechanism, and it actually gives you, and this is something you didn't see on VHS machines until quite a few years later, it actually gives you a real-time counter. And something else I quite like is it's unbelievably quiet when rewinding or fast forwarding. You can barely hear it. In fact, I actually had to take that metal cover to the top of the picture off to actually see if the tape was rotating. And it does actually seem to, unlike other machines from this era, other formats from this era, it does seem to have a very fast rewind and fast forward function, which is certainly something that's quite unusual and quite interesting to see, particularly on a machine from this era. Now, I did have actually some problems with this particular deck, and I'm hopefully going to be dealing with those in another video. This is really just sort of the start of the project, just getting the thing working. But when I try to hit play, the machine only laces up part of the way. In fact, the lacing mechanism is very like the Omega wrap setup that Betamax machines use, and where, in other words, basically you've got a circular ring gear and it takes the tape all the way around the head, with the audio heads behind the main video head setup. So what I'm actually doing here is I'm just prizing out the lid, and we can actually now see the mechanism itself. You can see it's trying to lace there, but it gets to a point where it can't go any further. Now I think if you look to the top left of the ring gear there, you can see a micro switch, and there's a point where that micro switch has got to press together and I believe engage a solenoid which will pull back the metal bracket that I'm actually moving manually. I've got a feeling it is this that is causing me the problem, so I need to get in there with some electrical contact cleaner. Now I've put both the machines back in storage, but what I actually did was reassembled the machines in their entirety, put everything back to as it was, just mainly for safe storage and also to keep dust out. Hopefully next time, when I start to have a look at these machines again, I will get the playback working on my first machine, and then the next project will be to get the second machine working.